We are in Romans on Wednesday nights, and so I invite you to get your Bible. If you're watching at home, make sure you have your Bible, and maybe if you want to take notes, we're continuing into our winter quarter, the big ideas in Romans, and we're in Romans chapter 13. We've been in chapter 12 for all of December, and some of that was due to a special study on spiritual gifts. And so if, by the way, you have filled out your gift and passions assessment forms, you can leave them here tonight, or I think I've got most of y'all's anyway, or some of you turned it in last week. If you're at home and you've downloaded that, or you still haven't got a hard copy of that, we'll try to get that to you. Let us know so we could have a good indicator helping you out on discovering your spiritual gifts. But we're going to move on to the next chapter tonight. We're just doing this for this week, and we'll be in chapter 14 the following week. And we'll have a couple more special studies that are out of chapter 14 and part of 15. And then we'll come back and discuss whatever questions you might have. But big ideas, we've been looking at, what is the main thing for each one of these chapters? What is the main thing? I remember a quote, and I used this after hearing it. I thought it's a perfect quote to use. It's credited to George Sweeting, who said, "The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing." And it kind of makes me think that sometimes we preachers and maybe Bible class teachers, we dig into a lot of stuff and we delve out a lot of information, and by the time it's all said and done, it's overwhelming, and we get lost. We can't see the forest for the trees, if you know what I mean. We get hung up on detail. I remember when I was taking Greek for the very first time at Oklahoma Christian, one of the things our Greek professor said is, you're not taking Greek and you're not learning Greek so you can impress people with Greek. It's kind of like the archaeologist who's going out digging up bones, but he's pointing to all the dirt he had to dig through before he shows you the bone. You're looking for the bones. You're looking for the things that are treasured in the text. Greek is for you, not them. So that's kind of the way I feel like is a macro approach to Romans. So tonight we're in chapter 13. So it's a chapter that's got a couple little things to it I want to kind of deal with tonight. I think would be something important for us. And that is, how does a Christian relate to his or her government? How does a Christian relate to civil authorities? What an appropriate time it is for us to be thinking about how we should subject ourselves to government mandates and or policies. And of course, we're here with another spike going on of COVID, of this Omicron strain, I guess it is. And there's a lot of travel restrictions going up these days. And of course, still we have the employers of 100 or more employees mandating vaccines and things like that. And so we obviously, I mean, it's every day in the news, isn't it? You're seeing this push, although it may not be mandate, there certainly has been coercion, and no matter what side of the fence you're on, I think there can be two extreme activism things going on, and I really think it's time to, I don't know about you guys, I'm just going to stop right here and say this. I'd like to watch the news and coronavirus not even mentioned. COVID, not that we're ignoring it and acting like it's not there, we know it's there, but we are just so obsessed that that's the topic that I'm not so sure we'll ever hear the end of it to my lifetime's end. I think it's here to stay, but we don't have to dwell on all those details. Be mindful in prayer for people that have it and have gone through it and gotten sick, and we do have some of our own number that do have it. And so anyway, I'm getting a little sidetracked, but this is an appropriate chapter, isn't it, about how do we relate to the government? How does a Christian under a dictatorship, for example, maybe if you go back to under communistic rule, what's a Christian's role to his or her government when the government is not very godly at all? We're still blessed. I do believe we are still blessed to be in the United States of America. I hope you agree with that. I'd like to think that we are still one nation under God. I think I'm not too naive to think that we're definitely polarized, but I do know that there's a good number of us who are still a in God we trust type people. You know what I mean? And I'm glad I live in this country, and I'm glad I live where in this country that I live. I mean, we're in that what we call the Bible Belt, conservative. Some people refer to it as the flyover states or whatever, but I'm glad that we're in good company here, aren't y'all? I mean, we still have political divisiveness. I understand that, but I feel as though not anywhere. I mean, I don't think we have the pressures of trying to coerce one side to the other as much as maybe other parts of the country would. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say. But how do we relate to our government? So let's start reading, and we'll get into some of the discussion points. I've got a few questions to ask. In Romans chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Now that verse 1 really does set the thesis and the basis for how God is operating in the world. God is operating in the world. That's point number one. God is still alive, and He is still functioning, and He still has the whole world in His hands. Is that correct? We believe that. And we can see the providence of God as we reflect back of how He's worked in the past, what doors He's opened, what doors He's closed. Was that a hand up? You have a question? Oh, in the palm of His hand? He has the world. He's got the whole world in His hands. Oh, yeah. I think sometimes He would like to, as the world is in His hands, wring its neck. Is that kind of what you're thinking? I'm thinking that there are times that God certainly will. And we see this, don't we? I mean, there are times when you look back in Scripture, Old Testament, how far do you get before you get to the flood? The 6th chapter of the whole Old Testament, right? Genesis 6 is the flood. And what does it say about mankind in Genesis 6? Every thought and inclination of the heart of man was wicked all the time. And God said, I'm not willing to contend with man's spirit forever and ever and ever. And He told Noah, I've decided I'm going to stop this wickedness. I'm going to destroy all flesh. I'm going to destroy the earth by flood. God rescued this family from whom He pretty much restarts the whole procreation process through again in the human race. But we don't get very far past that till we're into another little story, chapter 11 of Genesis, where in the Tower of Babel, everybody just wants to build a tower and make a name for themselves. They have forgotten God. We're number one. That's humanism. When you put yourself before God, that's humanistic thinking, and that's where they were, and God confused their language so that they couldn't get anything done because of not understanding each other, and so that thwarted that plan. And we have other places throughout the Old Testament narrative where God is saying, I'm not going to put up with that. I'm going to stop that. I'm going to punish. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. We got Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19. That's not very far into the Bible. We're not even out of the first book yet. And look at the destructions that we've got going on in the book of Exodus. You think everything was hunky-dory when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, out of the slavery? There's some things that happened in that wilderness, right? Because of man's hardness of heart and wickedness. And right after receiving the 10 Commandments and coming back down off the mountain, what did Moses find Aaron and the people doing? Breaking the 10 Commandments. Breaking number one for sure, and breaking the graven image one for sure, because there's a golden calf there. But commandment number one is, you shall have no other gods before me. So with that said, I think it is wise for us to understand that when we read a verse like Romans 13, verse 1, there is an idealistic connotation that is to be understood about that may not always turn out being what God wanted. His ideal is the plan of God, what He intended to happen, but that doesn't always happen. Let me give you another example. God intended for man, I'll get this right. God intended man to marry and not ever divorce. Is that right? God hates divorce. We get that out of the book of Malachi. God intended for that. But also there are concessions made because of man's hardness of heart, because of sin in this world, where there are divorces. He, according to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 19 and Mark chapter 9, that's why Moses was willing to give a certificate of divorce, because the ideal wasn't being done, and God allowed it, but he hates it. And then in the Christian rules, we see a divorce is only for one reason: sexual unfaithfulness, and committing adultery, and that's the ideal of God. I don't even think, though, that when there's been that God likes the divorce. Do you? I think he really would want the marriage to stay if possible. But once that has happened, that's a trust that's broken. That's very hard to get back. I'm sorry to kind of run roughshod over your hand. I know you had a question, so I'm going to back up to you. He had the gift. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Not to throw us too far off, but I want to mention something that was something I was exposed to for the very first time, and it may be because I just live under a rock and didn't know any better. It probably was out there and I just never saw it. But there is a thought that Paul was married. But at the time he wrote 1 Corinthians 7, he was no longer married. The thought and this is take with a grain of salt, but here's the thought process. A lot of theologians, and I didn't know this, but after discovering it, I checked into it, and there is a popularity of thought that Paul, in that narrative of when Stephen was being stoned, is kind of being painted out to be part of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin Council is that group of the 70 ruling officials of Jerusalem deciding matters of law and tradition. That's the Sanhedrin. That Paul, by the fact that he was giving consent to the stoning of Stephen. Now, here's what we know. People were laying their coats at the feet of Saul. That was his Hebrew name at the time. I mean, it's still his Hebrew name, but we know him better as Paul. But they're laying their coats at Saul's feet, and it says in the text that this was him giving approval for what event was happening. Now, here's how I've always approached that. Paul was very determined to keep religion of Judaism as pure as could be, and he was willing to fight for it. And he was willing to stamp out anything that thwarted that went against that was blasphemous of that. He was a defender of God, okay? The reason he's persecuting Christians is because he thought the Christian movement was anti what God wanted. He found out different later. But that little passage that talks about him giving consent, some have taken that to mean he was the official giving the green light or the thumbs up for you to pick up your stones and start throwing. And that there's an implication that only meant that he was in the Sanhedrin Council. Now, what I think that means, and what I've always thought of this, is that he was so gung-ho that he was trying to get other people recruited. Here, I'll take your coat. Get some rocks. Here, I'll help you. There's a big one right there. It's the fostering and being the catalyst to it, trying to make sure that they were stamping out this Christianity, and Stephen was, number one threat at that moment in time, and became the first Christian martyr. Now, what difference did that make? Well, a qualification to be on the Sanhedrin Council is you must be married. So that's how there is this construct that Paul must have been married. If he was on the Sanhedrin Council, He'd had to have been married or he couldn't have been on it. Now, did his wife later die? Did he later, as he wrote about 1 Corinthians 7, what you're referring to about his gift of self-control, he's asking people, I wish everybody was as I am, but not everybody has that gift. But to remain unmarried, because Paul's purpose for marriage is boiled down to one thing, and a lot of people think this is crude, but the purpose Paul gives to marrying somebody in 1 Corinthians 7, you're going to take this, this may be a shock to you. It's not because you love them. It's because you can't control your sexual desires is the reason why you get married. And that is the reason that's given, and it is the reason why he does not seek for the married to get unmarried unless it is for sexual fornication. And he talks about the danger of a person that doesn't have the gift who is not married or is forced to not be married for whatever reason will be burning with passion. You remember that phrase, burning, will burn with passion. So it's an interesting thought, and I'm glad you brought this up, but it's a view that I just heard, and this is this last few months, that this is news to me. I never heard this before. He was trained by Gamaliel, who's part of the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin. And you know, Gamaliel's best known probably in Acts 8 when they're about to decide the fate of Peter and John, who've been preaching Jesus in the streets of Jerusalem. He's the one that says, you need to let these guys go. There's been others that come along and purport some Messiah, and we remember the time when so-and-so thought he was a Messiah, and it came to nothing, and over here there was a group, and it came to nothing. Now I'm paraphrasing this. But he says, let's just let these guys alone, because if it's a plan of man, just like these other things, it'll come to nothing. But if it is of God, you cannot stop it, or you'll be fighting against God. So he was the one that stood up, and that's Gamaliel, and Paul was trained by Gamaliel. But yeah, that's an interesting thing. But you know as well as I do, there can be an ideal. I mean, God's ideal was that man would never sin. But there is a course of action for when man does sin. And thankfully, after the fall of man, we had the redeeming plan of God in place for the Anointed One to come to this world. Even today, in the New Testament, we have this encouragement from the Apostle John, who says, I write this to you so that you will not sin. He's expecting us not to sin. Okay, I'll say this. I'm expecting Kevin not to sin. I'm expecting my wife not to sin. I'm expecting Lee not to sin. Amanda, don't sin. Larry, Ruth, no sin, okay? Landon, better watch it. No sin, buddy. Okay? I can have a little more authority with him, maybe. But guess what? All the ones I named, including Kevin, maybe. It's hard to imagine Kevin being a bad boy, isn't it? Is Amanda going to sin? Is Larry? Is Ruth? Yeah. Lee? Oh, judging is a sin, by the way. But also claiming innocence when you know you're not can be sinful. The fact is, we can have the expectations and we know what the ideal is. And so the beauty thing about what John wrote is the follow-up. He said, I'm writing this to you that you don't sin. But when you do, we have an advocate with the Father. When you do. I may be paraphrasing that just a little wrong. Let me see if I can just pick up on that really quick to see if I can get it out there just the way he says it. It's not if, it's when. I'm pretty sure. And I don't know if it's 1 John. I'm thinking it is. Some of you are in the internet world screaming the answer out to me, I bet, and I'm not hearing it, but I write this so that you may not sin. I was thinking it was the beginning part of one of the chapters. Let me just give me 30 more seconds. If I don't get it, I'll try to have some of you Google it or whatever. I write this to you that you don't sin. But when you do, where are you at? Come on now. intermission, right? My dear children. Oh, bingo. Chapter 2, verse 1. Well, it is if in this NIV. I was thinking it was when, though. My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not what? Sin. But if anybody does sin, we have an advocate with the Father. It may be worded the other way in some other Bibles, because I think I have read a translation that says, but when you do. This just says if you do. But I think there's a good probability that you will and that I will. Okay? I think it's very probable that I will. Possible at least, but probable for me. All right, so going back to Romans 13 then, that very first verse is kind of meant to be taken with a little bit of discerning it. In other words, you know how easy it is. We were discussing this not too long ago about when you look at the words love and hate, and especially the word hate, that hate just means love less. I think we were even talking about that last week, weren't we? You know, again, if you take it on the surface, it's going to mean to us the way we would put the connotation to it in our English language, and that's not fair because it's so limited in really understanding what was implied in the Greek language. I think the same principle can be of this chapter 13, verse 1. We obviously know there have been wicked leaders in this world, in history, and that there not just has been, but are and will be. Okay, I don't put Saddam Hussein, I don't put Osama bin Laden, I don't put the Ayatollah Khomeini in any of my good lists. Not that I'm their judge, but I mean, you know a tree by the fruit it bears, and we can obviously see bad fruit. You know, bad fruit. Hitler, I think that'd be a general consensus thing, wouldn't you? I'm going to stop short of naming more names, but I think we can all see, we can obviously, with the mind and thinking process and discernment that we have given to us by God, can determine some right and wrong among leaders. So keep that in mind. But the ideal is that God puts them in place. Now, here's a statement that Jesus makes to Pilate. Pilate was a governing authority for Rome. His job is stationed at Jerusalem, and there are other governors in other places all over the Roman Empire. But he's the one that's in Jerusalem. And his job is to maintain the peace among the people and just to kind of keep the affairs in order, to kind of keep things ruly so Caesar's not embarrassed. Okay? We can't have people subject to us who are trying to do their own thing and making a mockery of us. I mean, Jews were trying to do that, but his main job is to kind of, as a representative of Caesar, I'm here to try to keep everything in order. That was his job. When he asked Jesus about, is it true what they say of you? And Jesus, you know, he was silent at first, but he said, it is as you say. Pilate says, don't you understand that I'm the one that has the say on whether you live or die? He says it this way, that I have the authority. And Jesus' response to him was what? Do you remember? The authority that you have is yours because my Heavenly Father gave it to you. Now, think about what Jesus said there. As a matter of fact, it probably would be good to note it from the gospel text itself, but I'm not sure if I'm going to get that exact wording out of Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. Let me come back here for a second to do a little digging, because I'd like for us to review that. When he's before Pilate, this is Matthew 27, is before Pilate there. He says, are you king of the Jews? Verse 11, you have said so. And then he gives no answer. And don't you hear the charges they're bringing against you? Let's see. I'm not seeing that dialogue there. Let me come back to, they bring him to Pilate first, and he sends him to Herod. And I'm not seeing that part of it in Matthew. Let's move to a different gospel. Sorry, I didn't realize this is the way my thought process tonight was going to start going, but Lee has a tendency of throwing me off. I'm kidding. I'm just... Jesus arrested in Mark 14 before the Sanhedrin. Peter disowns Jesus before Pilate, chapter 15. And are you king of the Jews, verse 2? It's as you say, or you have said so. Are you going to answer, see how many things they're accusing you of? Do you want me to release? Okay, I don't see more dialogue there. I don't see any more dialogue between Pilate and Jesus there. Let's go to Luke. Let's go to John. I'm not sure John deals with Pilate. Let's see if he does. He does. This is chapter 18. What charges are you bringing against him? Verse 31, take him yourself, judge him by your own law. They're wanting to execute him, and they know that if we take him to Herod, we can't get that done. So he says in verse 33, are you the king of the Jews? Verse 34, is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me? Pilate said in verse 35, am I a Jew? Your own people and chief priests handed you over. Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest, yada, yada, yada. Verse 37, you are a king then, said Pilate. You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side. Okay, what is truth? That famous discussion there. Still don't see. I don't see what I'm looking for. Okay, I'm going to have to take a rain check on that one. Okay, I'll get it to you once I do remember it. I'll try to remind myself to give that to you next week. Let's get back into 13. I'm not trying to chase rabbits, but that one I think is valid concerning what subjectiveness we have to ruling authorities. Here's a question. Was either Caesar or even Herod, who's nothing more than a puppet king, during the time of Christ, very godly people? No. You know, we know one thing about Pilate already from a teaching that Jesus gave. This is recorded in Luke chapter 13 about when he's trying to bust that myth about bad things happening because you're bad. But bad things happen to good people too, right? And that's the point Jesus is making. And so he makes this point. He gives two stories in Luke 13. One is this. He says, remember that time when there were those people that Pilate mixed their blood with their sacrifices to make a mockery of them? In other words, they had been slaughtered, and Pilate was making fun of what it was they were trying to do. And Jesus' rhetorical question was this: do you think they were worse sinners than any other Galileans because of what Pilate did to them? That's telling us something about Pilate and what his character was about slaughter. He wasn't godly. Herod wasn't godly. Now, I know there's several Herods, but none of the Herods were really ever godly. You had one who had his brother's wife, and you had the one that was, of course, back in the birth of Jesus going on, wanted to go find out where Jesus was to get the report back from the Magi, right? So he could go kill him because he didn't want anybody taking his throne away. We have the Herod that was in the Bible that was, remember how he died? Remember how one of the Herods died? Anyway? Again, I can hear the screaming on internet. He was eaten by worms. Y'all don't remember that? Eaten by worms? Now I feel like I got to go confirm that. He was eaten by worms. If you can Google it, you'll find it. Oh, I don't know, but we did this at a VBS one time. It probably wouldn't be something I would do again today, but you know those things you get on the 4th of July that's a little pellet that when you light it on the fire it starts growing? And we had this boy. Do you remember this? This was at Cherokee. Do you remember this, Lexi? We hot glued a bunch of them on the guy playing King Herod, and we lit him up, and he walked out with all these things growing out of him, and he was going like this, acting it out like he was dying, and it looked like worms were coming out. It was really cool. Acts 12? I thought it was one of the Gospels. Acts 12. You know, kids think gross things are cool. Now, Sister so-and-so might have lost her lunch. What verse? 12:23. Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. So, hey, we found a verse. Good. No, Herod is a title, and it becomes their name kind of, but there's a Herod Antipas, there's Herod the Great, there's Herod this, there's Herod that. So, there was various Herods coming up through the time of Christ. So, but the Herod that obviously was during the time Jesus is being arrested and stuff is the one that had John the Baptist beheaded. So that is that Herod. So he's not good either, because John's the one that was telling him you can't have your brother Philip's wife, and it's not so much that Herod wanted to do that. It's that wasn't it the daughter, after doing a dance at a party, pleased everybody, and Herod said, "I'll grant you any wish," and she says, she went to her mother, and her mother asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Y'all remember that one? We need to play Bible trivia. That's what we got to do. We got to learn some trivia here. Yeah, that's how that went down, and he had John the Baptist beheaded. So, okay, so in Romans 13, then let's move on with verse 2. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. I'm sorry, I meant to follow up on a point. I will get to the rest of the reading here. What I was asking was, do you think Pilate or Herod or Caesar were good people? And the answer was, or godly people. And the answer was a resounding no, right? Yet, let me ask you this question. Does it appear that Jesus subjected himself to those authorities that were in place? I got one nodding their head, yeah. Someone's thinking, this is a trick question. Huh? He didn't, and he could have just, to Pilate, just close your mouth, and I mean, he could have forced him to close his mouth, He could have reacted like Peter does when he draws the sword and cuts off the Malchus's ear, and he said, put your sword away, and Jesus picks up the ear and puts it back on his head. He is subject to these authorities. As a matter of fact, well, actually, whose laws? Are you talking about Rome's laws or the Jewish traditional laws? Because that's where they think he's law breaking. That he's done stuff, he's healed on the Sabbath. So he's done stuff on the Sabbath. He claims to be God, and they're saying that's blasphemous. Well, but right. He doesn't stop doing that stuff, but the fact of the matter is he doesn't really break any laws. They just think that he does. It's wrong to claim to be God when obviously you're not. Is it wrong to claim to be God when obviously you are? That's not blasphemy, because it's the real deal. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Okay, thank you. John 19:11. And this is John 19:11. Okay, yeah, thank you. Verse 10, when you go back to verse 10, are you refusing to speak to me? And Pilate said, don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you? In other words, he's got the authority, right? And Jesus answered, you would have no power or authority over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. That's interesting because one way you can take that is, Pilate, you're doing what you're doing because God put you in that position. The guy that brought me here doesn't have a position of authority. He's, at least you're following through what God knows was to happen. I mean, still Pilate tries to set him free, but you have that conversation there that I think is really cool, where I stand on that answer to the question of Jesus, did he subject himself to the authorities? He did. And he had to, or prophecy would not have been fulfilled that talked about the lamb was led before the slaughter. And I don't like these words because it's a word, again, in the English language has a different connotation to it than in today's language than it actually means. He was led like a lamb before the slaughter, dumb and silent. But dumb means without being vocal. Silent or not. Dumb actually means loss of hearing, not hearing. And the silent, what? Deaf and dumb. Okay. Well, I may have that reversed. But it meant that he would go without retaliating. He would go willingly. Yeah. So dumb in the Bible does not mean what we think it means today or how we would use it today. But that is him subjecting himself to the authority. And Philippians 2 would also confirm that he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself what? Well, let's look at Philippians 2. I know we're doing a lot of cross-referencing here, going all over the place. He made himself, verse 7, he made himself nothing. Made himself meant I'm going to subject myself to their protocol. He made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself, becoming obedient to death. He goes through with it. I heard a sermon one time at Tulsa Soul Winning Workshop. It was Jerry Jones who delivered the sermon, and the sermon title was "On the Cross, Not Double-Crossed." And what was being implied by the title was Jesus didn't mess up and go too far and overstep the boundary and got himself crucified. Jesus, that was the goal, was to get crucified. See what I'm saying? He was on the cross, not that he was double-crossed and ended up on it. It wasn't incidental. It was intentional. That's actually a sermon point I'm using Sunday morning. Point 3, point 3 is not worded that way, but it's under point 3. Just remember this. Discipleship is not incidental. It's intentional. Say that with me. Discipleship is not incidental. It's intentional. You have to mean to be a disciple. You can't just accidentally fall into it. You are intending to do something. And so that's the nature of Jesus from the New Testament. It's part of the prophecy. It's what he does in the John passage. It's what he's doing in all the gospel accounts of him subjecting himself, even though you have ungodly rulers. Now, remember back in chapter 12 where God said to not take vengeance into your own hands. Remember that? Leave vengeance alone. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So for the ungodly rulers, they'll answer to God. But God still expects us, to the best of our ability, to submit, to be subject to the governing authorities. But let me say one more thing, because I just want to make sure, as we run out of time, that you don't misunderstand what I'm saying. In the book of Revelation, you'll see this more evident than probably anywhere as far as the documentation goes of New Testament letters. Although Peter will write a lot about suffering and tribulation and trials that the early Christians were going through, and you'll read history books that talk about the martyrs, and you'd read up on all those martyrs and how gruesome it was. To denounce Jesus is what they were trying to get you to do, or they would burn you at the stake. It would be sinful to denounce Jesus. Why? Because Jesus himself said, whoever acknowledges me before people, that's the ones I'll acknowledge before my Father in heaven. There comes a time when there are principles that you must hold on to, that you cannot allow governing authorities to upstage you on. They're what I might call trump cards, the exemption clause, or however you want to put it. I will do what the government's asking me to do until it violates my allegiance to God. And in the book of Revelation, what's going on there is there's a Caesar in place named Domitian. because I believe Revelation's written about his time frame, 95, 96 AD, right toward the end of the first century, who had claimed while he was still alive, I'm Lord and I'm God. Now, Caesars that had died, Roman Senate will confer upon those Caesars that had already died, they would confer deity to them. And they build shrines all over the land to worship this Caesar who had died. And that's true of Nero, it's true of I used to be able to name all these Caesars, but it's true of all these Caesars. It was an emperor cult worship system in the Roman Empire. But Domitian didn't want to wait till he died. So he forces the Roman Senate's hand to confer deity on him then. It don't matter what a body of people will say about you, you're not God. But he wants that. In other words, for a Christian to say Jesus is Lord is breaking Roman law. Now this is by the time you get to the end of the first century. You have to pledge your allegiance to, you have to worship. That's no other way to put it. You have to worship Caesar. He's the supreme being in the land. When it comes to that, you have every right given to you by God not to break his rule that says, you shall have no other gods before me. That was the very first commandment. And that first commandment is upheld under New Testament law. We put God first. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, right? That's Matthew 6:33. So I've got that said, so let's plow on through the rest of the book now so we can get that going. So verse 2 again, consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. Case in point, Peter cutting the ear off the Malchus. Jesus has put your sword away. Don't do that. Don't retaliate here. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. In other words, it won't go well for you if you go that route. Verse 3, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. That's the ideal. Okay, we know there's exploitation of this, but if you are a law-abiding citizen, the general rule of thumb is the law, the authority, good doers. And he says, do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what's right, and you will be commended. Okay? It says, verse 4, for the one in authority is God's servant. Was Herod God's servant? Yeah. I'm not saying he was godly, but did we not read that Herod's where he's at because God put him there? Remember the statement to Pilate, the authority that you've got is because my Father gave it to you. Remember that? Is Caesar God's servant? Yeah. Is Pilate? Yeah. Oh, you're already getting ahead to where I was heading. You see how this gets to be very hairy, doesn't it? And I wouldn't, you know what kind of trouble we could all be in if we go to the 21st century and we start talking about is so-and-so, is so-and-so, is so-and-so. But as hard as it is for us to maybe swallow, there's a purpose for even the wicked leaders, and history records this for us. There's a purpose that God had in a Nebuchadnezzar. There's purpose that God had in a Belshazzar or a Darius or a Cyrus. There was a purpose for Pharaoh. Pharaoh served God's purpose. They don't know this, and they're not godly, but they were there because God put them there. And that makes them God's servant. It doesn't make them right with God. But God was hardening the heart of Pharaoh, and he's softening the heart of Pharaoh, and he's hardening the heart of Pharaoh, and he's softening the heart of Pharaoh. Who's in control, Pharaoh or God? Pharaoh's going to bend to everything God once willed Pharaoh to do. And I think that's true of their leaders today. That God's still in control. As we started off, I said, is God still in control? He's still got the whole world in his hands, right? There may be a reason why we can have some ungodly leaders. There can be a reason for that we don't understand and we not like it. But it's going to serve some purpose for God that you and I just may not be able to fathom right now. There's a reason why God allowed wicked nation Assyria to come in and take his people Israel into captivity to punish his people. He allowed Assyria to come over, destroy and ransack the temple, put nose rings in their noses, and chained them all up and drug Israelites into Assyria. And if you think that's bad, just wait a couple hundred years when Babylonian captivity takes place and see how they drug off Judah into exile. And God orchestrated that in both instances. In Babylon, what's Babylon? That's modern day Iraq. That's what that is. And Assyria, probably Assyria is, it may be up as far north as Turkey, but probably all the Middle East there that you're talking about. Iran in the book of Daniel is referred to as Mede and Persia. Persia is Iran. So Medes and Persians. God orchestrated all that. Okay? So the one in authority is God's servant for whose good? Your good. Even though it may not seem like that's good. But it is for your good that you go through trials. It's for your good that you have learning times of experiences where you fall down and not everything's going to be perfect, but that's a learning experience, and it causes you to be having more perseverance and stronger and more resilient. But if you do wrong, be afraid. The rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. God is using secular rules to help carry out disciplinary measures of moral law. Now, in this chapter, there can be a debate about capital punishment. And, I don't force people's hands on that. I have a personal opinion on that. And, that's something that can be a very sensitive topic, and especially right now since Oklahoma has now picked up, continuing the executions that it has lately. But let me say it this way. God's point in this chapter is that we just try to do the best that we can to be good and not do the evil to retaliate. Because God is obviously using secular authorities to carry out some of the disciplinary measures that go against his own moral laws. It's the law of the land that it's wrong to kill an innocent person, but that's also, more importantly, a moral code by God himself. Thou shalt not what? Murder. So God is using secular authority to help police, control, and administer consequences to the wrongdoers. Any questions? This really was a... Yeah, go ahead. Did they hang him? Yeah, they hung him. That's right. Mass destruction. So when you're saying he knew how to run his country, we should have left him alone. Okay, I'm entitled to have you be entitled to your opinion, and I'm not sure I would even disagree with that. But I am seeing what you're saying. But where I thought you were going with that is, do you think Osama bin Laden was an idiot? Do you think Hitler was? Insane or crazy, maybe. But these are perfect examples of people that knew how to network their sources. How close were we? I could be saying Guten Tag to you tonight when we're done. And not that I love Germans. I love everybody right now. But in that era, we were so close. And a lot of people don't realize how close to the edge we were with the Cuban Missile Crisis either. But what I'm here to say tonight is you have people that, although they're wicked, are good at what they do. And that's how they got into the dictatorship, or so much influence. Huh? Yeah. It's not, I'm not saying that's morally right. I'm not saying it's ethically right. There's all kinds of moral and ethical things going on wrong there. But they were good at what they did. Verse 5, therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of a matter of conscience. Okay, this is why you also pay your taxes. This is why you also pay your taxes. Now you're shaking your head, no, I'm reading verse 6. This is also why you pay taxes. You still say, okay, you're nodding, okay. You know, Jesus answered that question too. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and that's about the taxes. Were there abuses about taxes? Oh yeah, they were overreaching, weren't they? It's huh? Oh, well, yeah. So it's not taxation with representation, but it is, you know, it's what Jesus endorsed. It's what is told here as a mandate that we do that, pay our taxes. There's another passage, by the way, that talks about honor the king, and that's general. I know we're not a monarchy, but honor the king is a rule that we honor and this is really important to say. I know y'all will agree with me. Honoring the office can be different than honoring the person occupying the office. You know what I mean? And I think by all means we honor those positions. We may not have the people we want and the ideal people that we think we would need, but we need to honor the structure that's in place that God set there. Did you have another question? And things can go awry completely against what God wants. But, yes. Well, to what end? I mean, take the persecution to what point? If they're asking you to denounce Jesus, then yes, take the death. Well, let me back up here, because you're going to get me into you're pinning me down to pacifism, and I'm not going to allow you to do that. If there's one country that's overpowering another country, and we come in and we are trying to liberate that other country, which is what most of these wars were about, you are operating under the governing authority you're under, not theirs. Okay? And the reason I say that is you are to go and defend what your country is asking you to do, the freedom, you know, it costs. Freedom costs. And we have examples of God's own people doing this, that God has instructed them to go and do. So I don't think there's a pacifist argument. But when your own government has pinned you up against the wall, is it going to be the Caesar or is it going to be Jesus? You better say Jesus. And that's when Jesus says, don't fear the one that can kill just the body. Fear the one that can kill both body and soul in hell. So when you get killed for defending Jesus, you have done what Jesus asked you to do. And I think every Christian martyr that we read about were killed for that very reason. Stephen definitely was defending Jesus all the way. But you can use some discretion. I think there are times where you think, well, should we not stand up for what we believe is right? Yeah, stand up for what you believe is right. know. This is a good observation, and it's a good question, and a lot of people get confused about this. He tells Peter, put away the sword. There's a reason he gives to Peter, though. The reason given to Peter as to why you put your sword away is, well, that is true, but what he says is, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Now, you take that for what, but it doesn't mean, don't make that mean that because it's sinful to have a sword. It's just stating, you got to remember, when you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. If you're going to dish it out, you better be ready to take it. And I do think it's a timing thing, because Jesus had to let this happen. Put your sword away, because, Peter, you got the wrong motive. And what Peter wants is to start the liberating for a war right now. It's a totally wrong thing. But you're right, and this is for the internet group that's watching. What's been brought up is, in this one instance, you have Peter being told put his sword away, but before Jesus ascends, he talks about, if you don't have a sword, sell your coat and go buy one. There is a means by which you could say Jesus was saying you have every right for self-defense or whatever you might need that sword for, but it's not this war battle that you thought of all the time that you're going to be fighting. Paul will put it this way, our battle's not with flesh and blood. It's against the rulers of darkness, Ephesians 6. So that's a good observation. Let me very quickly, I've got 1 minute left on the clock. No, that's fine. Good conversation. This next part, verses 8 through 10, let no debt remain outstanding except continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. And he gives examples. I'm going to skip that part, but he's mainly saying love is important here. Some people want to take this and say it's sinful to have debt. No, we know that Jesus talked about how to deal with debt, and we do have a verse in the Bible in the Old Testament that says, just remember, the borrower is subject to the lender. In other words, he's your master until it's paid off. This is saying let no debt remain outstanding. What's it mean? Pay your debt off. That's what it means. Pay your debt off. Just because you're a Christian now, don't think that, oh, okay, I don't have to owe anybody anything. Everything I got now is all belongs. God is expecting you to pay back your debt, okay? That's part of being a good steward. It's part of what Jesus meant. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's. Give to Johnny what's Johnny. I mean, you borrowed that wagon and you broke a wheel. You need to pay him back and repair that wheel or whatever it is, But love is the main subject here. It's not about whether you can go in debt or not. It's love. That's the main thrust. Then the following verses that end is how we need to use our time wisely. I'm going to let you read that on your. We don't have all the time in the world, and we don't. And that's as much a precious commodity as money is, maybe more, that we do good with our resources, honoring God with our resources, knowing that we might have to lay our life down even, or have to sacrifice some of our own freedoms. I'm American freedoms. There's not near as many freedoms they had here in this context that I do. But they knew the real freedom wasn't in the freedom they could get from civil authority. The real freedom was what they could get from what the reward would be in heaven. And real freedom is in our eternity, our hope, our assurance in Jesus Christ. I'm going to have to sign off, so I will bid you adieu till Sunday morning. I will say this about Sunday morning, starting a new series called Destiny, and it's a walk through Ephesians. And we're going to talk this Sunday morning. This first lesson is living on purpose. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.